Hello and welcome to the latest episode of Harmonious World. My name is Hilary Seabrook. And this is a very special episode because this features not a musician, but a fan. The person I'm interviewing today is Dan Jennings, who hosted the Desperately Seeking Paul podcast. And not only is this episode number 200, which is a real milestone for the Harmonious World podcast, but it's also coming out on the 40th anniversary of the release of Café Bleu, which, if for anyone that knows, is my claim to fame. I played sax on the Style Council album from 1984. Anyway, I hope you enjoy listening to my conversation with Dan Jennings, and you'll see why that's relevant. Hey.
Ah, how are you? All right?
I'm good, thanks, Dan. How are you?
Yeah, I'm all right. I think, it's all a bit chaotic, life generally, isn't it? But, it's
Well,
fine.
yeah. But I think life is better when it's chaotic. I don't want a boring life.
No, that's fair. That is fair. It's trying to spin all these plates. So I basically have created an extra job when I already had a job.
Yeah.
which I was already busy with, plus having two kids. It's just like, whoa. But that's fine. How's things? What's going on? When are we hearing music? That's what I want most importantly.
Well, it won't be long.
Well, that's what I like to hear.
Thank you for joining me on Harmonious World. This is a reversal, isn't it?
I know. I'm not sure I like being interviewed. It's weird.
Well, it's not really. It's just a chat. So
I like being the one asking the questions. I don't know if I like this side of the desk.
Yeah. It's interesting for me because I usually interview people that make music. And this is, I think, quite an important moment for my podcast because you are somebody who is just a huge fan, aren't you, of Paul Weller?
Yes, it's fair to say.
Yeah. And I think that as musicians, we wouldn't be anywhere without fans. And I think it's important to hear those voices sometimes,
I think that is true to a certain extent, but you musicians could exist without us, and you'd be playing beautiful music without us. But I know what you're saying,
Yeah.
to have an audience is important, but there are probably there's so many great musicians who don't get heard, which is a crime in itself. But no, that's very nice of you. So so I'm the first one with no musical talent whatsoever on the podcast.
Completely.
I'm honoured.
You should be, but I think it's a really.
Genuinely, I am. That's brilliant, amazing.
Yeah. I really think that it's important that you're on the other side of the speakers kind of thing. And also for me, obviously, we've got a real connection because you like Paul Weller and I played with Paul Weller. So, we've got that.
And I liked your bits when you played with Paul Weller as well, we should say as well, right? So it's like, the Style Council was a fabulous band.
Yeah.
And the music you lot were involved in creating still stacks up. What are we talking about 30 years later, right? Yeah. Wow.
Actually, it's
sorry,
40, it's 40 years
40,
now.
Sorry, 40 years later. Gosh, yeah.
It's scary, yeah. I'm really interested in hearing your perspective. So tell my listeners the story of the podcast that became 180 episodes, lasted 3 years, of Desperately Seeking Paul.
Okay, so my life before this podcast was as a radio broadcaster. I was on various big stations across the UK that you'll ever have heard of. And I that was all I ever wanted to do as a kid. I just wanted to be a radio presenter. I love listening to the radio and I love music, like you've said. But I gave it up. Like around now, it would be around about 13, 14 years ago. I kind of fell out of love with it. But I'd always been itching to kind of do something behind the microphone and always wanted to kind of, do something in that space. And obviously podcasting, as you'll know, is a huge, big thing these days. We can all create in the same way as musicians can create music at home. We can create podcasts at home. And I was thinking for ages and ages, this idea about wanting to do a Paul Weller podcast because I was a big fan and wanted to talk to people who had been involved in creating his music. But I didn't really have an angle, anybody could do that type of podcast. And then just before the pandemic, the awful pandemic and lockdown hit, I stumbled upon this idea that actually from giving up my radio career it was my one big regret to never get to interview Paul Weller. And so I created a podcast to make it happen. It was that was genuinely the idea. I thought this would just be a little lockdown thing. We created it in the. I kicked my youngest son out of his bedroom. We turned it into a studio, and lockdown happened, and I started recording interviews and conversations with people, thinking, as soon as we're out of lockdown, this thing will finish. And then the idea was I'd talk to some fellow fans. That was the idea, and it soon just spiraled out of control, really, where I started talking to, I mean, ridiculously, like bandmates like yourself, like who had created this music that I loved, talking to tour management and roadies and people who create the tours and band members from the Jam and the Style Council and the solo years. So it just kept building and building and building to the point where I couldn't ever seem to finish it unless the thing with the idea was it was the podcast existed so I could get the interview with Paul Weller, and then ridiculously at the end of last year that happened.
You handled it brilliantly. So
Oh,
you kind of went, right, this is over. I've done this. This is not happening anymore. And everyone was like, oh no, that's really sad. And you got the Guardian involved and all of this stuff. And it sort of grew and grew and grew. And little did we all know that when you made that announcement, you had already booked in that time with Paul.
yeah, the day after, I think I'd recorded with Paul on the Monday. The Tuesday, I made a kind of jam-like announcement that it was all coming to an end. I
Yeah.
paraphrased the press release that Paul put out back in the day.
Yeah.
And yeah, but what was really funny was, so the Guardian got in touch and everybody started kind of tweeting and tagging in Paul Weller's social channels or whatever, saying, I can't believe you're not doing it with Dan. It's a disgrace.
Yeah.
And the Guardian rang me and were like, "Oh, we want to help you get the interview with Paul Weller. Um, let's do an article about it, and we'll see if we can make it happen." I was like, "Okay, I need to tell you, the Guardian,
Yeah.
it happened yesterday. It's fine, don't worry." So, but
Yeah.
then they kind of announced the exclusive. But yeah, it was funny that because everybody just started tagging in Paul Weller's account, going, "How dare you not do the conversation with Dan?"
Yeah. Well, because he's renowned for not loving interviews, let's face it.
Yeah,
But
and I think that made me nervous as well because
yeah.
leading up to or the initial idea 3 years ago is what if I ever get the interview with Paul Weller, he always seemed to hate being interviewed. So I was like, is this going to be like a good thing or not? Who knows?
Although I think that your take on this was always you love the music that Paul Weller makes, and all he wants to talk about is music.
Yes. Yeah, and
And,
I think also if you think about, I mean, you do your research and into the podcast, I can hear that, right? And I'm really passionate about that. I love diving
yeah,
into the stories and the research bit of it as much as I love having the conversation. And I think if you think about it, it was 179 episodes of research to get to that conversation with Paul. So I certainly felt prepped when I got there.
right. Yeah. Yeah. And we've always got on. He and I have always got on. And I think that that's because we all just want to talk about music, and we want to talk about musicians. And I can remember in those days of the Style Council talking about people that he liked, and I was introducing him to people that I liked, and he we all went to a Junior Walker gig, and I'd never heard of Junior Walker, and I was like completely blown away by this sax player who was doing the stuff that I wanted to do, and I'd never have discovered that without Paul.
Isn't that wonderful? But also,
Yeah.
what I really love about Paul and people like yourself is that it's still now you want to discover new sounds. Whereas so many people, and this isn't a criticism necessarily, but will be, they'll have their fixed kind of period for even the bands and artists that they love. People, might love, I don't know,
Yeah.
Coldplay, but they'll go, well, yeah, I did the first 4 albums and then I don't need to hear any more Coldplay. I mean, that's true for all of us, but even the big fans, they'll be like, I don't need to, I've got my
Yeah.
Coldplay.
Yeah.
Whereas for me, it's all I love hearing not just what Paul's doing next, but being discovering new music, new sounds, different artists, and being introduced to new music. It's really exciting. So I love that
Yeah.
about the fact that so even where I can see now, you've got like a doormat, which is it Black Pumas? Is that what behind
Yeah.
you? So
Yeah. Yeah.
another
Yeah.
band that I actually discovered, I think, through Paul. But I would see that, and then I'd ask you the question, and then it'd be like, okay, I'm going to go and put Black Pumas on afterwards. That constant discovery of new music, I think, is really exciting. I love that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've got the Black Pumas rug, but I've also got a Tubby Hayes
Yes.
thing because I was involved in the documentary for that. And so it's that eclecticism, and I interviewed China Moses yesterday, and she's incredible, and we were just like name dropping people that we like listening to, and stuff that's going on, and new helping new artists. And I mean, you look at the stuff that Dee's doing. She's got a new album coming out
Yeah,
this
yeah,
month.
yeah. It's all and constantly. I mean, that's what I love about Paul, particularly. It's like that constantly moving forward and not resting on your laurels, and
Yeah,
still wanting to create. I mean, it's this spring's releasing his whatever it is album 28th, I think, in total career
yeah.
total. Um, but still, that is not. When you go and see his shows, it's not a nostalgic trip. A little bit,
No.
but he's still he wants to play the new stuff live. He wants to still be making new music, which is great, isn't it?
Yeah. The only thing I was really, really peeved about was I watched a video from when he was in Japan a couple of weeks ago, and he's got a baritone sax. He has never used a baritone sax before, to my knowledge. And I
Really?
was like, hey, listen, if you were going to use a baritone sax, you know me. And I would,
I'm meeting Jacko on Friday. Jacko
are
P.
you?
I'll mention that to him.
Yeah, yeah.
How funny.
Yeah,
Brilliant.
I know, absolutely. So your love of all things to do with Paul Weller, did that start when at the time when you were young? What was the first thing that made you go, yeah, I like this?
It's funny. My music tastes before that were all over the shop. A friend of mine the other day found an invitation for my 16th birthday party, where I was obviously DJing. I must have had like a disco equipment or whatever. And you look at the list, and it's all the stuff that was big at the time, like CNC Music Factory and the KLF and the
Yeah.
Shaman and all kinds of weird trance stuff that I was obviously into. But and then there's that kind of cut. This was been 16, like I say. But I was thinking about it, where I would have discovered Paul Weller at 17, and then very quickly all of my taste became guitar-led music. Like I ditched all of that stuff and was into, and I guess it was kind of around the time of Britpop starting, if you want to call it that. But bands like the Stereophonics and the Manics and all those kind of very guitar-led music. But yeah, I just overnight almost kind of just ditched the thing. But my discovery of Paul Weller, I don't know whether it was the radio or Top of the Pops. It would have been one of the two, and it was his second solo single called Aha Oh Yeah.
Yeah.
And Jacko was in the band, funny enough, mentioning him at the time.
Yeah.
Steve White, Kamel Hines playing in the band. And I just loved it. But the funny thing was, I genuinely thought I discovered, this was during the summer holidays, I genuinely thought I discovered this new artist. And so it was like raving to everybody about, oh, you've got to hear this song, this fella called Paul Weller, to all my mates. And then we had some builders in at the time. And I was saying to them, or I had it on or whatever, and I was like, "Yeah, there's this new guy, Paul Weller." They were older than me. They're like 20 years older than me, whatever. They're like,
Yeah.
"Yeah, yeah, mate, we've heard of Paul Weller."
Yeah.
And the next day they brought in a Jam greatest hits cassette, I think it was, and they were like, "Yeah, I ever listened to this, and this is the Paul Weller guy." And I hadn't even realised, obviously, there was all this massive back catalogue, but it was
Right.
quite impressive.
Yeah.
So then discovered the Jam, and obviously then off the top back of that, the Style Council, which was just amazing. I loved that idea. You can just kind of dial into almost these two careers, as well as the thing I was about to just go into, this journey of all this new music coming up.
Yeah.
Was yeah, amazing. But yeah, I'd have been 17, I think.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, talk about new music. I mean, Paul, when we were doing the Style Council, I mean, bearing in mind he was probably a fairly, well, he was certainly very established. He probably had, enough money for the studio and all this sort of stuff. And he was giving studio time to these artists that nobody had ever heard of, and were most of them fell by the wayside, but they still had that opportunity, which I think is so generous of him.
Yeah, it's funny. Obviously, the conversation with Paul that I did end of last year was down at Black Barn Studio. So Paul's
Yeah.
current studio in Ripley, near Woking, and there's a great big whiteboard. And on the podcast, I interviewed Charles Reese, the studio engineer, and I was trying to describe this whiteboard. So if you imagine the months of the year down the left-hand side and numbers across the top, and Charles went, "Yeah, it's called a calendar." Like, oh yeah. So there's this calendar whiteboard, and it has all the dates on it of when like Paul's on tour
Yeah.
and when they're in the studio recording. But what is also on there is all the times when Paul's not in the studio, of when they're giving the studio to new talent, like you're saying, like
Yeah.
people like Lucy Rose has just recorded her. I say new talent. Lucy's been around for over a decade now, but still these amazing artists. The Stone Foundation were down there very recently
Yeah.
recording that new stuff as well. And he's not charging them for that. He's just giving that studio space and these engineer for free because he loves those guys, but also he wants to support new music. The Stripes were in there a few years back doing their stuff, you know,
Yeah, I
really
remember
young
that.
band. So yeah, it's
Yeah.
amazing that, isn't it? You kind of
Yeah.
you know, just yeah, I'm not there. Please use the space, please, you know.
Yeah. Yeah.
Don't
Which
use
I
all the
think,
tea bags, but other than
yeah.
that, he's probably fine, you know.
Yeah, right. Absolutely. Yeah, no, I just think that that whole ethos of, what's new, what's out there. And I read somewhere else where he was talking about, there's nothing wrong with people that want to do these revival things and, looking back at everything. But I honestly can't imagine anything worse. For a little while, I played in a tribute band, not a Style Council tribute band, but it was a sort of a ska. Well, it started off as a ska band, which I thought was great. I
Yeah.
loved it, and then they kind of went, "Oh no, we're just going to do Madness and the Specials," and I was like, "Yeah, but I don't want to just do that, and I don't want to." Also, I don't want to be just reproducing the singles
Yes,
that
right.
were,
Yeah, yeah.
big 35 years ago. Because if you go and see Madness now, they're not playing stuff exactly the same as they played it 40 years
Yeah,
ago.
even those big hits, they still
Yeah,
evolve, don't they? And the same with Paul, you know, those songs
yeah,
evolve over time and you
yeah,
how that shout to the top, how that sounds now compared to how it sounds, it's different. It keeps evolving in for him and for the audience. I love that. Yeah, it's
yeah.
funny because you talk about like the kind of discovery of new music. Paul was asking like what I was listening to, and we were discussing. I gave him a couple of vinyls, and I was kind of trying to find the details on my phone to talk him through what they were and stuff. And as I was scrolling through my Amazon Music account, he's like looking over my shoulder.
Oh,
But also, it's like on there is, you know, my kids use my Amazon Music account,
of
obviously.
course.
So I'm scrolling past like Ed Sheeran and like slightly dying inside as he's kind of looking at my music, like, you know,
Yeah,
that's not
yeah,
mine, Paul. That's my kids, you know.
yeah, 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 yeah. But it's interesting because you talk about people like, Ed Sheeran, and I often have a conversation about Taylor Swift because, those guys, they write all their own stuff. They're
Yes.
just because it's a different style, and it's very, very popular and designed to be popular, and it's aimed at a particular audience and all the rest of it, doesn't make it bad music.
No, is no, and they're huge talents. I mean, I
Yeah.
jest a bit because
Yeah, no,
you know,
no, no, I
I
absolutely.
particularly when he first came along, I think Ed Sheeran, but also the hours that he put in, you know,
Yeah. Oh
on
yeah.
people's sofas and doing those tiny gigs and that
Yeah.
whole kind of what is it, 10,000 hours to become an expert or become a genius rather.
Yeah.
Yeah, he put in the time, right? He put in the work, and
Absolutely.
clearly he's, you know, to be able to kind of command the audiences that he does live when it's just him and a foot pedal or a couple of foot pedals or whatever is just
Yeah.
incredible. So yeah, no, absolutely, that huge talent. And that
Yeah.
thing, and I thought, but actually, even the writing your own music thing, I'm not too snobby about that. Like Liam Gallagher, I'm not a massive Liam Gallagher fan, but the fact he doesn't write his own tunes is fine with me. You know, Elvis never
Yeah.
wrote his own tunes. That's
Well,
fine, isn't
no, that's true. Neither did Frank Sinatra,
yeah,
you
there
know.
you go. He was all right.
So
I think he did all
yeah.
right, didn't he, for
Yeah, he
himself?
did okay. Yeah. One of the so obviously this is called Harmonious World because it's from a Quincy Jones quote. Because I love his arrangements and the fact that, the people he's worked with. I mean, he's worked with everybody, but hit that quote about imagine what a harmonious world it would be if everyone shared a little of what they're good at. But
Nice.
his other quote, which I really like, is the only music I don't like is bad music, which I think is great,
Yeah, nice. But also that thing of even the bad music, somebody will like that, right?
Well, yeah. Yeah, that's fine because
Yeah.
that takes it's like that the joke, the good thing about Sainsbury's is it keeps the hoi polloi out of Waitrose. And that's true of bad music. It keeps them away from,
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
gigs and that
It
sort of
was
thing.
funny because at the weekend, at the time of recording, there was the Brit Awards, wasn't it? At the
Yeah,
weekend,
of
just
course.
gone, right? And I'm now at that age where you just look at your feed and everybody's going, I don't know who any of these people are. And I was like,
Yeah,
that's okay. Go and have a listen to them. Whereas everybody's like,
absolutely.
this is all terrible. It's like, no, it's not terrible. It's just not for you, maybe. That's fine. But
Yeah,
go,
yeah,
go and listen to it. Whereas I think you say about Quincy Jones, but actually the one thing I did like before when I was like before Weller and I had that terrible music taste that I mentioned was Michael Jackson. And that was the
yeah.
first gig I ever saw live was Wembley Stadium, the Bad Tour. And Quincy Jones working that production on those
Oh,
albums, it was just incredible.
it
Amazing.
really is. He is, we use the word genius too easily, I think, sometimes, but he absolutely is. He just gets music and
Mm.
gets those sounds. And, it's like Stevie Wonder, writes incredible music, performs incredible music, but it's catchy and it makes you want to
Yeah,
dance and it
yeah.
makes you want to sing and so yeah,
It's annoying, isn't it? It's so, I mean,
I know.
so talented, isn't it?
I know.
Well, I
It's,
mean, like
it's
Stevie Wonder was like actually and Jacko as well, right? So they were doing it from like 7 years old or something,
yeah,
daft, wasn't it?
yeah,
It's like,
exactly.
amazing.
Absolutely. Yeah, 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 yeah. And we were talking about before as we started recording this, we were talking about the work that I'm doing with Stuart Prosser, another ex honorary councillor. And we haven't been able to do it for a little while. We're going back in the studio. It's like it's really exciting. And it's lovely to just be able to be creative. And I think once you've got that bug, it's you can't let go of it.
No, it's funny that because I think like the giving up the radio thing, there was always something kind of itching away in my mind or
Yeah.
whatever of just kind of just because I moved like completely away from it at one point, right? So now I'm like nothing to do with radio and that I worked behind the scenes in radio for a while, and then I moved into kind of what's grandly called business transformation, but I don't know what that is either. But the project management ultimately, right? And
Yeah.
there was always this thing still of like even like the sitting there editing for hours of an evening, the early hours, that felt like you're making something that you're putting out into the world. So, I mean, if I had any ounce of talent in terms of making music, I'd be doing that as much as I could because it's just brilliant, isn't it? The
Yeah.
fact you can kind of, in the same way as creating a podcast, you can go into something with nothing, you have a conversation, you edit it, you put it out in the world, and people listen. What? The same, like
Yeah.
if I could do music as well, like you're creating something completely from scratch. You're collaborating with maybe your mates, and you're doing it solo in your bedroom, whatever, and then you package it all up and you put it out into the world on Spotify and people can listen to it. It's just bonkers, isn't it?
I know. It's
That's a
crazy.
thing, and that
Yeah.
people do that. And so yeah, I think that the whole that journey of creating something is as exciting as the kind of end result for me. And I think Paul was talking about that actually with the conversation we had. It's like the process you go through, the making stuff. Like I said, for me, it's about the research and the conversation and then the editing and putting it live. That's the same when you're making music, isn't it? I
Yeah.
think, yeah.
Oh yeah. Well, yeah, and actually the research that is just listening to loads of stuff. I mean, I know people who don't listen to music, and I'm like, what?
What at
How does
all?
that? Yeah, yeah. Honestly, I have one friend in particular who just she'll get in the car and she won't listen, and it's like my my radio goes from by the side of my bed to walking the dog in my earphones to in
Yeah.
the car to whatever, and it's just a constant. And because you'll suddenly go, oh, hang on, what's that? Oh, and that I don't ever want to lose that.
I can't get my head around that. I've got a friend
No,
who goes at lunchtimes, he goes for a walk for about an hour and doesn't listen to anything. Like, well, not podcast, not music, just the noise of the traffic, I guess, is walking on. And I couldn't get my head around that. But he does listen to music at other points, but to not
right.
listen at all.
No, I know.
Wow.
And to not have a kind of have an opinion about it, because that's what's nice about, and I think it brings us right back to talking about, you get the bug for you really like a particular artist. There's I think for most of us, there's one artist that if we could meet them,
Right.
that would be great. I actually met Quincy Jones, and so I'm a bit like, oh, okay. Now what's next? A little bit.
I think Paul Weller there was a Quincy Jones concert a few years back, and I'm sure Paul Weller played at it
I
and
think he
sang a
did. Yeah.
Sinatra song or something. I think if I remember right, or
Yeah.
something like that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Yeah.
yeah, it's funny. I mean, as you say that, it's kind of it's that connection not just with recorded music, but for me as well, live music,
Oh, absolutely.
and
Yeah.
that thing of lockdown, and when we didn't have that. My first gig back was like a Q&A event, but there was Simon Fowler from Ocean Colour Scene was
Oh,
playing with
yeah.
Oscar, just the two of them, little acoustic thing as part of it. It's like a book. It was a book launch, and it was the first thing after we'd had what it had been like 18 months maybe without any gigs or something. Um, and I went to that, and it was a really emotional moment. And I couldn't work out if it was because of a certain age and my connection to those songs was when I was like in my late teens, early 20s, or if it was post lockdown. And I think it was the post lockdown, just that we were starved from the kind of live music thing, and
Yeah.
suddenly it happened. And I was standing at a pillar getting a bit emotional at one point because I absolutely, and again I can't. I've got friends who I'll suggest like going to gigs and stuff, and they're like, "Oh no, we don't do live music." Like, what do
Yeah.
you mean?
Yeah.
What do you mean you don't do live music?
I
I mean,
mean, that's what it's
why?
all about. That
Yeah,
is that is literally what it's all about.
yeah. I
And
say I have friends; they're not friends any longer.
yeah, no, absolutely, you're mixing with the wrong people. Um, One of the things that I'm doing now that I'm working on at the moment is I'm collecting I'm writing a book, and it includes the extracts from these conversations that I've had with my podcast guests, because that's coming up for 200 now. And I spoke to some amazing people, especially during lockdown, who I would never have had the chance to do if in the normal course of events. And uh everybody's experience of lockdown as a musician, everybody's was different. So some people did some sort of acoustic things where they played, um did Zoom, whatever, dial in Facebook lives, whatever. Then there were other people where venues started setting up, so you could go into a venue and play a gig, and it was streamed, but there was nobody in the audience, or just
Right.
the
Okay.
crew or whatever. And telling those stories is really interesting. And I was talking to China Moses about this yesterday, and I was saying that I really want to tell this story because I don't want us to forget how disruptive that period was.
Yes. Yeah, and you can't, and we don't, we hope that that's not going to become the norm, and that that's going to happen every 5 years or whatever. So I think to capture that moment in time, because
Yeah,
we will quickly, even the behavior that we had at that time, where we definitely had an appreciation for some things like
yeah,
nature more, or music more, or whatever. You don't want to lose that, and I think there's a danger where in 5 years' time we'd have all forgotten this lockdown thing, and we'll just be back to how we were before. And I think that's a great idea.
yeah,
But also I think you're right, because some people really embrace that. Like Paul talked about the fact he went back in and created a new album. And he did have the luxury of having his own studio and stuff. Whereas I imagine for a lot of musicians, particularly because you can't gig, and that's the biggest source of income, frankly, right? We're
yeah.
not getting any money from Spotify and Amazon
No,
Music or whatever.
no.
That must be terrifying, because it's not like you're working for a company and they're going to furlough you. It's, and there was very little support for the arts, if any,
Yeah,
from the government. So yeah, I can't, I've spoken to a lot of musicians as well on the podcast, and I think that would just be a terrifying time, I think, because you didn't know when it was going to finish, right? And when you would get back
right.
to it, there was no
Yeah.
end in sight at one point.
I know people who lost their homes
Right.
because they couldn't pay. I mean, the landlord wasn't going to go, oh, it's lockdown, don't have, I
Yeah,
won't,
yeah,
don't give me any rent. And they had to move back with their parents. They had to go, all sorts of things. Um, and that's really terrible. And I don't want to lose that. I don't want to lose that, because I think it's important that we remember, we hold on to that. And also, particularly as the COVID inquiry is still ongoing about, what other people were doing through all of this. So, those of us who couldn't be creative and whatever, and there were other people who were just doing whatever they wanted.
yeah. It's
So,
also that thing of not. It wasn't just the musicians who were here. You obviously have the venues, but then
oh,
also
yeah,
the what we lost from the industry was also that those experienced hands who can set you up, on the stage and
absolutely.
balance your sound. And
Yeah,
a lot of those people left the industry. So what you now have is massive inexperience at venues, and you end up having lots of bands that I talk to and musicians I talk to where it's really hard to get the balance of sound right on stage, because all of those brilliantly talented people who've been doing it for donkey's years just went, yeah, I'm out now. I can't
yeah,
do this
yeah.
anymore.
No, that's right.
Which is, yeah, really, really, really sad.
Yeah,
And then again, but also it's that value of the arts thing. It's for me, where like today just been announced, like Birmingham City Council have just announced that they're about to go bankrupt again. So the first thing they've cut is all the money for the arts within Birmingham, and it's
yeah.
like, I don't know why we don't have. To me, music is and creativity is such an important thing. I don't know why we don't value that more. The
N-
people who create it, we're happy to not pay them anything through Spotify and whatever.
Yeah,
We don't buy, a lot of people, I buy physical music again now because I want to support the artist. But yeah, we seem to not value it in the same. I don't know why. It's bizarre to
yeah.
me.
But I also think there's something about the fact that those people who are in a position of power know that if you're a musician, if you're a creative, you're going to carry on doing that.
Yeah.
And actually, we're not going to stop creating music. We're just going to do it in different ways, and we're going to get it out to people in different ways. One of the best things that came out of lockdown was Bandcamp and the way Bandcamp works. And, they did Bandcamp Fridays where they didn't make any money. And everyone was promoting their stuff to make us so they could get as many sales as they possibly could on that Bandcamp Friday, so that Bandcamp didn't take their cut and it all went to the artists. And for Bandcamp to do that, that's amazing. I mean, obviously, long term, it's a great business model, because it means that message comes across, that actually Bandcamp supports musicians in a way that a lot of other platforms don't.
Yeah, but wouldn't you love to see that? I'd love to see that from like Live Nation or something like that, right?
Oh,
So
yeah.
Announce billions of pounds, record profits.
Yeah.
Wouldn't it be great if actually £1 off every ticket went to the Music Venue Trust and went to grassroots level? Because where's your next Ed Sheeran coming from? Ed Sheeran, like you say, playing all those tiny venues, surfing the sofas of his mates and whatever to do that. Where there's not that support. All those, it's the amount of venues that have closed over the last year.
Yeah,
it's frightening, and it's but wouldn't that be a great thing to do? And actually, could the big artists, lead that as well?
Well,
£1 off your ticket. So I'm going to mention that to the Weller camp.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, yeah, but the thing is, as you said, Paul's already given, his studio to help. He's always been. He's one of those guys that just does loads of stuff and doesn't talk about it.
Yeah.
He's not sending out press releases going, "Oh, I've just done this. Look at me. I've done this." So he would do it, and you'd never know.
Yes, that's very true. That's very true.
Yeah. Hey, listen, Dan, it's been great talking to you.
Oh, no, thank you for having me. Like I say, it's a genuine, real honor, because you're a fabulous broadcaster as well as a musician. Look at you spinning spinning all the plates. And this, and to be the first guest on who's got literally no musical talent whatsoever. Can't even sing or do the hand claps, So no, it's a real honor. So thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining me for that episode of Harmonious World. Wasn't that interesting? So you can listen to the past episodes of Desperately Seeking Paul, including the final one, which featured Mr. Weller himself, and the one with me in it. Thank you for joining me once more for Harmonious World. And I'm looking at the moment at the list of guests I have lined up for the coming 12 or 15 weeks. So there's going to be lots worth listening to. I look forward to sharing those conversations with you. Thank you for listening to the latest episode of Harmonious World. My name is Hilary Seabrook, and it's a great delight to bring this series of discussions with musicians and composers and writers and all sorts of people to you. Obviously, there's no point in having a podcast if people aren't listening, and I'm very grateful to my listeners for doing so. Thanks also to Joe English for composing and performing this new theme tune. So wherever you get your podcast, you can leave a review. You can share this with your friends and family, either as a link or on social media and that sort of thing. I'd be really grateful for that. Don't forget that you can subscribe now. There's a link wherever you get your podcasts. So have a great week, and please remember why I started this, which is just to try and make the world a little more harmonious. Thanks for listening to Harmonious World.